Hello and welcome to the Homebase podcast. I'm Valerie Khayat. Today, for our very first episode, I'm joined by founder and principal investigator of Homebase, Dr. Richard Hovey, who is also an associate professor in the Oral Health and Society Division of the Faculty of Dentistry at McGill. Hello, Dr. Hovey. Thank you for being here.
Hello, nice to be here.
I want to jump right in. This is a very exciting project that has quite an interesting history in the way that it has come to be. Let's start from the beginning. So you're a qualitative researcher in the Faculty of Dentistry, and for years you've researched pain in other people, obviously, but few researchers have perhaps ended up gaining the kind of perspective about their own research that you were afforded through your experience. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so as you mentioned, I was doing research basically around suffering, which included pain. It also included preventable medical error, diabetes, osteoporosis, and I got to know people quite well who were living with these conditions, but none of which I had at that point. So I'm always looking at it from the perspective of somebody who thinks they understand what it means to live with complicated health issues. And I thought I was doing a very good job until after a cycling accident, I was left several months later in my own extreme pain that went from acute to chronic over a period of several months, and now it's been well over 3 years since I've been living with the pain. And it was at that point where I started to really understand what it meant to live with chronic pain. My first couple of years with it were dramatically life-changing. I wasn't sleeping very much. It was hard to concentrate. You get very, very despondent over the fact that you can't do things the way you used to do. And you look fine. So you get a lot of this sort of idea that, well, you're not limping anymore, or this is not going on, but the pain is always there. Now, the interesting thing to me was that I finally got up the courage to go to a pain support group meeting, and went there not as a researcher for a change, but as a person living with their own pain. And I was very intrigued by the dynamic of what was happening in there, and how people looked out for each other, and how people supported each other, and unconditionally. It was a wonderful experience. But I also noticed that there were very few men participating in these pain support groups. And I asked about that, and they said, well, we get 3 or 4 out of maybe 20, 25 people, and they consider that to be pretty good. And I said, well, where are they? And they go, we don't know. They just don't seem to come to pain support group meetings. So I thought to myself, there must be something else going on, because where are these men if they're not here? Or do they have something else that's going on that I don't know about? And I thought that I did. So what I did was I started to listen very carefully to the men who were there about their experiences, about the gaps in healthcare, and the lack of understanding of masculinity as an encultured way of being in our world. And to do that, the idea of a support group was not quite addressing the ideals of masculinity, of what it means to be a man, and to how men like to communicate and do activities together. So I was thinking about that when out of my email comes something from Movember, the Canadian Movember Foundation, who had a call for funding, a pilot project, looking at how to reduce social isolation for men in any way or form. And I just thought about the chronic pain. For people to overcome this huge energy gap and this huge isolation gap, that we needed to do something a little bit differently. So having a background in philosophical hermeneutics, which is a way of understanding complex thinking, complex experiences, I put together an abstract for the Movember Foundation. And apparently they received 440, and 80 were moved to the second level, which was a pitch, which was a 3-minute video and a 1,500-word written pitch or proposal. And we sent that in, and then we became one of 25 to get funding to design the pilot project. Now, the interesting thing about all this is not like I'm a healthcare provider who then did all this and invited the men into it afterwards as patients. They were the group that basically worked with me, brainstorming and discussing and conversing over what was missing in their experiences as men as they work through the healthcare system and what they're left with. And essentially, the healthcare system does their absolute best to help people, but it's overburdened, and it has limitations for funding and other kinds of programs. So what we did was we thought about what would be interesting for men to do, and we had this idea of home base, and of course home base has the metaphor of baseball, and most of us as kids growing up played baseball, or at least we understood what baseball was, and we have things in our language like I'll touch base with you later, but also home. We wanted a name where people would say I'm going to be safe here, I'm going to do stuff that's going to help me transition.
So this project is built around the topic of chronic pain. Mm-hmm. Chronic pain is a very complex theme in itself, but it also touches upon isolation, mm-hmm. even more so than just the chronic pain. Why is isolation so important? Why is it so important to address that?
Well, isolation leads to potentially loneliness, and recently I've seen in the news, and a lot of research is saying that isolation is a very important health risk factor. So isolation means that you have, with nobody to talk to, it's almost like being incarcerated in your own pain, and this incarceration means that you withdraw more and more and more to the point where you may become despondent, you may become anxious, you may become depressed. And those without purpose, without any sense of identity, may be a reason why the suicide rates for men are higher, especially living with pain, than in other contexts. So it can be a very serious problem for men who isolate themselves. And again, without the sense of purpose, not only purpose for themselves, but purpose for others, because we want to give back. Mm-hmm. And nothing makes us feel better than giving back to our communities or to others. And so if you're helping another man trying to deal with his chronic pain, at the same time you're working the community, all of a sudden you've repurposed yourself. Mm-hmm. And you've restored yourself to a point where you now have something that's meaningful to do because you are helping again.
Can you talk a little bit about this idea of restoring? Because if we go back to your own story, can you lead us through this in a little bit more detail? You had this happen to you. You went into acute pain, which turned into chronic pain. That's a process in itself. But what was the transformation like? That transition from your old self to your new self. What was that like?
Well, I think what I experienced, and my research has always pointed out that people go through a transformational process, and the first one, of course, is accepting that this is something that's permanent, most likely, mm-hmm. and with that acceptance, you begin the possibility to restore yourself. Mm-hmm. Now, restoring comes out of a philosopher's perspective on how we need to narrate our chronic conditions, and this is not in a therapeutic context specifically, but it's in the context of how to start to rethink about, or how to reconceptualize yourself in the world. Mm-hmm. And so in that, when you're doing this, is that you're caught in between. You're caught in between who you were and our identities. By the time we get into our late 20s and 30s, are closely related to our jobs, what we do, how people see us, and then pain comes into the picture, and all of a sudden that all sort of dwindles away. To you're left with a shell, if you want, of who you used to be. And so you don't know transformatively how to go forward. At the same time, you can't go back to who you are. So this is when you literally, or maybe metaphorically, sit in your damp basement not wanting to do anything because you just don't have the energy. You're anxious, you're apprehensive. I mean, all these emotions that kind of paralyze us sort of come into place. So what we do find that even as I worked with these men, is that as this project gave them purpose and gave them identity, they started to become way more engaged in challenging their pain and what they could do. So even in the most simplistic terms, when we restore people by having them start to think about who they are and who they could be living with pain, it kind of changes the dynamic, that you now have a more positive outlook, but also you begin to imagine again. Because you lose your imagination when you're in pain, because you can't imagine your life or doing anything in pain. So giving people back choice, imagination, reflections on your self-humility, your commitment to what you want to do, discernment that you don't make a decision that you're not ready for, and lastly, hospitality, to welcome everything that comes in. even if it's negative, because negative information also tells us something about the direction we should take next.
You're talking about welcoming, you're talking about accepting. Some people, as they're listening to this, might be thinking, well, is accepting like giving up? It's a bit, is it like quitting? Just saying, well, it's never going to change? What's the distinction between?
It's kind of like turning it around. It's the same as saying, we use the word surrender, and surrender has a very negative term. But if we surrender into something, it just means that we accept it as being part of my life. Mm-hmm. And so if I can accept it, and I can now put it behind me rather than it leading me all the time, then the pain has to follow me in my direction. It's going to constantly remind me that it's there, but now I'm in charge of my pain rather than in charge of me. And it's a reversal. And I think that's very important. And I think the whole idea of transformation is coming to the realization that once I surrender into it, then the idea of me doing something about it with others, you can't necessarily do it by yourself. You need to get these out with others to discuss and to explore and to imagine. Then to be quite honest, something magical happens. Mm-hmm. And we're not really trained in our lives to do this, but it's interesting because adult learning theory has transformational learning theory, which is about exactly that, on how adults cycle through basically a shattering or a disorientating dilemma that turns their life upside down. And then the idea of being in that middle part, whether you call it surrendering or if you call it accepting, is coming to an understanding of what you need to do and how to do it. And finally, you move into what I call the dance, where your dance partner is always pain, but you're leading it most of the time rather than it leading you.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask you, before this event took place in your life, what led you to research what you research? And then how did your perspective on that change once it was so close to you in your life?
Well, it started out, I go back to the first event in my life where I was not the very first, when I was at I was living in Regina, and I was part of a community program, and we're looking at food baskets and why people were throwing stuff out of the food baskets, and it was interesting because the default was that, why are they doing that? They're not appreciative, and so I wondered about that, and I sort of said, well, has anybody ever asked people why they throw things away? And they said, well, no, we never thought about doing that. So I went out, and when the food was being delivered, and I said, excuse me, I don't mean any offense by this, but why are you throwing that away? We don't know what it is. It doesn't taste good to us, or we don't know how to prepare it. So there was my first introduction, unknowingly, into qualitative research and its implications for change. And we devised a program that then would help take the baskets with the people who are coming in, with nutritionists, into a cooking environment, and we would cook food that tasted good to them, but doing it in a more nutritious way. And so that spawned my thinking that understanding complex human interactions often starts with a simple question: why? And so when I finally was working my PhD, I did it on the meaning of living with osteoporosis, and I was a man who was not living with osteoporosis, but what I heard from people during my time in different boards of directors stuff was the idea of loss. Literally a loss of bone, but also a loss of life, and not death, but life. I used to do this, now I can't do it. And then I started to hear these healing stories of people who work through all these different challenges. And I understood that from an absolute perspective, sometimes loss is something we can share an understanding in. But each loss is a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And so as I started to move my research agenda along, it became about suffering. And what I've learned about suffering is that I may not be able to change the chronic condition, but we can mitigate suffering by giving people opportunities to restore themselves.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of restoring, it was a necessary step for you in terms of attending support groups yourself. Mm-hmm. What allowed you or enabled you to finally take that step? Because it must have been new territory for you. Also, you're wearing this researcher hat all these years, and now you have this accident happen, and you have to, I guess, adopt a different perspective on it to be able to create change in your life.
Yeah, and that's that to me was one of the most awareness events in my life, and I realized that what we do as researchers and clinicians and other types of researchers, that we approach many things from a theoretical biomedical construct. So by not living with pain, and I'm interested in pain as a clinician, I learn about all the different ways to treat pain. And maybe as a therapist, I learn all the ways to help people who are going through depression and stuff. But that's quite different from the person who ends up in pain, because they are unwilling and unsuspecting victims of that pain. And so the interesting thing is that they have the lived experience of pain, and they work through it, and they try to do their best, but then they meet somewhere in the middle. It's kind of like a bow tie, where they come into the middle into the knot. And then you have these different narratives that compete with each other. So on one side, the brevity of healthcare wants Likert scales of 1 to 10 in intensity of pain, whereas you have a story about how pain has changed your relationship with your children or grandchildren, how it's changed your relationship at work, or you've lost at work. And somehow in there's this competing narrative, or lack of narrative, that we're trying to identify as being more important or as important as the cure itself. And so the idea then is, as healthcare tries to anesthetize pain, we want pain to speak. And since it's not always practical in a busy healthcare clinical situation, we want to offer those opportunities in the community, where I'm no longer Richard the patient, I'm just Richard at the YMCA, or I'm Richard at some other event. And that helps me to restore myself as a person, not as a patient. Because after all, I'm only occasionally a patient, but always a person.
Can you walk us through in detail through the event that happened to you, and how challenging that was? Because you had the accident, and then you had to understand what was happening to you, and then you sought help. And it's a whole trajectory through the healthcare system as well. But can you just speak about how you felt through that, as you were trying to make sense of what was happening to you and as your life was changing?
Well, the way we define pain is that it's acute pain, depending on who you read, from 3 to 6 months. And what happens is that your experience of pain for most people is one where you have an event, and the event gets taken care of. So let's say, for example, you had you broke your arm, and you had a cast on it, and 6 weeks later or less, the cast's off. You have a little bit of tenderness, but then a couple months later, you're going, I don't even feel this anymore. So we have in our mind a model of healing that is absolute, that it gets to the point where it goes away, or it's so negligible it doesn't really change.
It's about fixing something.
About fixing it, right? So in that model, when you first have a chronic pain episode. And for me, it was after my cycling accident. I was rehabbing from that quite successfully, and I played tennis one evening. And after the tennis, and nothing happened there. I went home, and I went to bed, and I woke up thinking I was in a nightmare of the worst pain I'd ever experienced in my life. And then I realized I wasn't sleeping, and I had the pain shooting down into my foot every 10 seconds, and cramps, and my back was just radiating. It's sort of like somebody who had electrodes they were placing onto my back, and on my foot it was numb and painful at the same time. And I told people, sort of like pouring boiling water on it all the time. And so it was like somebody following me with my foot bare, and they were just pouring water on it all the time. And I remember sitting in the back porch, it just relaxing, and a fly landed on my foot, on the top of my foot, and I jumped like somebody had dropped like a brick. And I realized then that this was something different. I also looked at my insurance, and for the first year and a half, when I got my insurance summaries, I had like 5 pages of physiotherapists and osteopaths and everybody else, and I had MRIs, and I had massage therapists, and I had nerve block injections and all sorts of things. And I realized that this all took place within the first 3 to 4 months. I was completely consumed by getting rid of the pain, and I was completely engulfed in the healthcare system. The next person will help me, the next person, the next opinion. And then you start to realize that after a while, that after you get to about 6, 7 months, that, okay, this isn't really, I'm now being told quite sympathetically that there's nothing else I can do for you. And then my next question was, well, what should I do? And then the answers to me were quite vague. They were, well, try yoga, try this, try that. But there wasn't saying, well, go to Homebase. And that would have been helpful, because then I could have gone to a website, I could have had a list of all the different activities, who to contact, and I could have done this in a couple of days rather than 6 months to a year. And of course, during that time, you become physically inactive, you gain weight, your physicality deteriorates as well, which is not helping your pain. And all because you have these uncertainties of how I should be moving forward with my pain. And I think that was one of the biggest eye-openings for me was this lack of coherency between, even the education courses that were available for people with pain and the next steps. So they should be seamless. And I should be able to leave a course on how to manage my pain to the next day to find a place where I can do that. And so one was called the toolbox, and then one should be the shed. And this is where I'm going to use my tools. And we had nothing like that. And so that was basically the idea. When we finally learned that we received the Movember grant, it was very exciting and a little intimidating because, to do this is a little bit different. But the men who were working on this and our partners, we have partners with the Canadian and Quebec Pain Association. We have Concordia University's Perform Center. We have the YMCA is an amazing partner because if this works the way we want it to, it can then be rolled out throughout Canada and then beyond, which was what Movember would like to do. So we have all the right partners at this point. And we're working very diligently with, and I'm amazed by the commitment of our partners. They're just wonderful, and they're just so, they see the need immediately because everybody knows somebody in pain who's somewhat isolated or completely isolated. So it's not like where people are going, "What? Isolated? What do you mean?" Everybody knows somebody.
Right.
And these.
Do you think the function of this program will only help people who are in chronic pain, or also educate others about this?
Well, I think it's going to help. I think it's going to help everybody because what we plan to do as well is to design learning modules, not only for people living with chronic pain, but also to help people learn from people with chronic pain. Because sometimes it's very difficult when you become an expert on something to listen to somebody who's not an expert but really has that lived experience of living with pain. And if you were to think about that qualitatively as data that you then interweave with your theoretical knowledge, then you have a more holistic approach of how to talk, and engage people who are living with chronic pain. And I think that's what this hopefully will do. And we will be designing courses, we'll be designing other things, not just for the men, but also for the people who look after them.
You've talked about the Movember Foundation, who fund initiatives that are for men, also around preventing isolation and everything that comes with that. Is Homebase only for men?
Well, the idea of Homebase then is to have a focus on men, but we also know that the programs that we're running, for example at the YMCA, can be easily extrapolated to co-ed ones as well. So we want to have a program that are for men, geared towards men, using a gender sensitivity around masculinity, but also we're not going to exclude women. The interesting thing is that if a Y were to put up a notice saying that we have a pain class and 100 people came, there would be 90 women and 10 men, if that many. So women tend to seek out these things more than men do. So it's not going to take anything away from women's programming. We're going to add to it, but at the same time we're focusing in on men because that's who Movember funds. And so in order to honor that contract with them, that's where the emphasis is going to be on. But everything we learn is transferable to women as well.
Right. And your story just so happened to be so personal that it came out of your own personal story, which, you're a man, so it led you down this path, and this initiative can grow beyond the borders of gender.
It's all that, and I think it's a really good example of how a researcher like myself, who has a philosophically based approach to things, approaches what people refer to as patient-oriented research differently. So instead of building something and inviting people into it, we built it from the ground up and then sought out people who could help us. And that's a much different approach, and it was very interesting because everybody who we invited got very intrigued by it and actually listened more because they weren't coming in order to be an expert in the context. They were there to learn from the men and what they needed.
Why is that important, not only for Homebase, but also for the field that you work in? Why is that important to have people come in and listen to patients that have the lived experience?
So right now, in the Canadian landscape of funding, research teams are now having patient partners come in, and the patient partner is supposed to be the voice of the patient. But this is a little bit problematic in some ways, based on what I said before, is that the patient is not a patient. They are a person with skills and they have background that can be very helpful. But when you're so I'll put it to you this way: we have interdisciplinary team and interprofessional, being a patient's neither a profession or a discipline, so you're always on the outside. So we need to develop communities of care in which everybody has a place. And the idea of expert then becomes a diminished concept, but people who are knowledgeable about something work together synergistically in order to produce something bigger than themselves. So I always prefer the idea of I'm a pain perspective partner. I can give you my perspective on pain, but I'm not a patient right now. And it's interesting because sometimes it's hard for people to get their head around that because we want to, keep people separated rather than bring them together. And then it's not done in a way that is purposeful. It's just it slips off the tongue better.
All of this touches upon so many areas of human development, of personal development, such as identity. We're talking about restoring oneself, masculinity. There's something interesting that happens beneath the surface when we're talking about restoring. Because as you restored yourself, did you find yourself restoring also your own masculinity because of the pain?
Yeah, I think what happens is that pain is an incredibly humbling experience. And I think during that humbling experience, you then realize you need to listen differently, you need to talk differently, you need to be with people differently. And I think that was a huge transformation in my life because I thought I already was doing that well. And I realized that I still wore the expert hat, and that wasn't really helpful. What people around me needed was for me to be Richard, to be somebody who listened well, somebody who listened more than they talked. And gave less advice, but let people talk through their own. Because a lot of people know what they want to do, they just have it in their head, and they need to talk it out in order for it to for them to make sense of it. It's almost as though when you write something about yourself and you leave it for a few days and you read it, you go, yeah, that makes sense. This is it. But if it just ruminates in your head, it doesn't. You can't bring it. It's less actionable than it is if you have a chance to discuss it and to try things out. And of course, this is what Homebase was about too, was having these conversations with these men who all shared the same situation. Their pain manifestation is quite different, but the same situation happens, that we needed something to help men before they slip into depression, before they slip into loneliness and isolation. And of course, the difference between isolation and solitude is solitude to me is a choice. So if I've had a very busy day around a lot of people and I want solitude, I'll go for a walk. But I know I can return to people. Isolation means I have very limited or no contact. So there's always a bit of suffering associated with isolation. And isolation then is the thing that over time could lead to loneliness, and loneliness then, as I mentioned before, is becoming a very significant risk factor for people's health.
The support group that you attended became a very transformative experience for you. Many of the participants in that support group are ambassadors in Homebase, and even hearing their stories and working with them, they have very inspirational journeys through their pain. What has been the most inspiring for you about being in touch with these other men?
Yeah, I think that at first it was just watching them transform. There used to be most of the conversations were about pain and loss and inability to do things, and over time, as we met more and more frequently, over a year now, or over a year, it's changed, and the talk is now a little bit about pain, but more about life stuff. And in our last meeting, it was really inspirational. 2 or 3 members who basically hadn't really spoken up a whole lot, but were very significant contributors, talked about this transformative moment where they said, I'm going to beat pain today. And they went up and did something that they wanted to do for a long time and challenged their pain. And by doing that, they said, I did it, I went home and I was tired and I was in a little bit of pain, but I felt so much better. And even though my pain's not, it may make my pain a little bit worse or it makes it a little bit better, but as a person I feel better, and that's worth it. And when I heard that, I was sort of inspired that this kind of approach really was one, in its simplicity, is one that we need. I mean, I'm not saying we don't need the therapeutic part that's professionally done for certain things, but for a lot of people who are just trying to find their way again, they need that buoyancy of others to help them in between appointments or for the next time they meet with somebody. And the example I use is that if you see somebody on a Thursday at 2 p.m. and you're going to see them again next Thursday at 2 p.m., what happens between those 2 days, that 1 week, is the difference between healing and not healing. And if you just sort of spiral down during that week, And even if you have exercise to do and stuff like that, and you haven't bought into it, you basically start over almost again at this next week. And so what we're trying to do now is Homebase would catch you, and they would give you something to do and support you. So then your next therapeutic session is going to be one where you haven't dropped down as much. And so you can progress hopefully a little bit quicker than that. But you always know that Homebase is there for you. And
so as this project really takes flight, now what is your greatest hope?
my greatest hope, I think, is that we are able to reach hundreds, thousands of men worldwide who hear about us and go, I want to do that, and I want to invite my friend, and we're going to down and we're going to build some birdhouses. Or I want to go down and I want to try this class because I used to love doing this, and I feel too unsteady. So I want to find the right exercises. I want to do this to build my confidence up again. I want some success. And I think, there in our lives, we kind of think about our large successes, our careers, our education, our any other thing like that. And really, at a certain point, it isn't the big ones, it's the little ones to keep you going. It's that first baby step, and you go, oh, okay, that's pretty good. I feel okay, and then the next one, and the next one, and pretty soon you're going from baby steps to strides. And I think that's the metaphor I'd like people to remember, is that it all starts very small, but then get yourself going, and don't look back. And yeah, you may have flare-ups and you may have setbacks, but they're temporary. You have to think about it, they're temporary. I'm going to take care of myself. My body's telling me something, and I'm going to listen to it, and I'm going to see who I need to see. But the first chance I get, I'm going to get back to not being isolated and seeing my friends and doing stuff. That's the idea.
Dr. Richard Hovey, thank you for your time today. Such a pleasure speaking to you. And we want to remind everyone that if you are interested or know somebody that could benefit from this program, you can go to www.homebasecommunity.com and sign up also for the newsletter to get more information, and just go from there. So we cannot wait to see what will come about for Homebase.
Thank you, Valerie.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.